So we are here with P. Djèlí Clark, the award-winning author of multiple novellas, short stories, and a full-length novel. P. Djèlí Clark, welcome to the Yukon Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay,
Great to be on this campus.
Absolutely.
Beautiful campus you have.
Yeah, I know. Are you familiar with it at all? Or?
I've heard about it once or twice, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, you should.
Team front here.
We can show you around later.
Okay.
Yeah, you should visit more often.
I want to see the Boonton. Oh no, is it the Benton? Yeah, that's right here.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't do art. So, P. Djèlí Clark, a consistent theme in your fiction is alternate universes. I mean, feel free to disagree with this. And there are boundaries that are frayed and open between different universes, and the sort of emanations from these alternate universes kind of change history at key periods of our own history. Yeah. What is it that so fascinates you about alternate universes and alternate histories?
Oh man, I don't know. I think I've always liked them. There's always things I've always liked. Like now everybody knows what a multiverse is. And it's interesting that now the idea is that alternate histories are multiverses. I like that idea. Like if you used to read Marvel comics, like What If? We're just like, oh, they were like alternate histories of the comics, right? But now they've done it to like, no, the what ifs are actually their own multiverse, right? They live there. And so I've always liked this idea of alternate history. And, growing up, the only ones I would ever hear is, what if the Nazis won World War II, right? That was like in everything. Or what if, the Confederates? It was always like, what if these bad guys had won? Then what would happen?
Right. So, statistically, something like 80% of all alternate universe histories are those two things, right? The South wins the Civil War or the Nazis win the Second World War.
And somebody does something, people tell stories therein. And I wanted to tell different alternative stories. I said, there's a lot more history to talk about other than those points. And I wanted to tell interesting stories. And my point always is alternate histories, I always say, are never fully about the alternate history, but it's people trying to tell you about this pivotal moment and why they think this moment is important. Or I want to tell you about why I think the Nazis were so bad, or so forth, right? McMahon and Highcastle. Like, if you didn't know the Nazis were bad, let me really tell you how bad they were, because this is what would have happened if they would have won. And so I always think it's an interesting way to talk about our history and our past through this alternative lens, or counterfactuals as the more, I suppose the most sophisticated way to say it. So I've always been fascinated in what they tell us about our history, right? And exploring this alternate nature. And I just wanted to do some that had different periods of history to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that happens a lot in your storytelling is the introduction of magic, the introduction of kind of supernatural elements. And so there's a speculative fiction tradition, of course, all around that. But one of the things that struck me as I was reading was a lot of this stuff reminded me of some of the South American 20th century literature, magical realism and boom stuff of Garcia Marquez and Cortázar and some of Borges' stuff. So I'm wondering, is that an analog for you at all, that kind of literature? And even if not, can you talk a little bit about why the introduction of these kinds of intangible, magical, supernatural elements are important to the storytelling?
I mean, I'm glad that people think I'm pulling from those. I mean, certainly I can't say that wasn't an influence, but so is like Toni Morrison's, I think, does that, where there's always this magic hovering in the background. Though I think with mine, people would say mine probably lips out for magical realism. It was like, oh no, there's Djinn walking around, right? Now there's magic here. The magic is a bit more intense than in some of those, or even like in Ben Okri's work, like the West African work, he has the same type of where it definitely lies in the background, but it's not, out front. And I think with me, for each story was different. So an alternate history like the Black God's Drums, I knew that I wanted to do this history that had to do with the Haitian Revolution, and I wanted to play around with West African religion. And so I had steampunk and everything in it. So I was already steampunk, some people say that's magic in itself because steam doesn't work like that. But yes, right? But it's just all the technology. And so it was already an alternate world where the American Civil War is still going on in the 1880s, right? It hasn't ended. And I decided, why not throw some magic in here? Why not? Because I'm a person who hates being stuck in any genre. So people are like, no, you're doing alternate history. You can't throw magic in here. Imagine me as the mad scientist, can't I? If I throw magic in there. And so, in that one, I think it really worked where, the main character, Creeper, she literally has this West African goddess who lives in her head. And it turns out that she can do things, right, because of this goddess. And so I wanted to bring that in there as part of this African worldview where there's this traditional African worldview, I should say, right? Religious where the supernatural and the natural can coexist. In another story like Dead Djinn in Cairo, like in that universe, magic was actually magic was my counter to industrialization and colonialism. I was simply thinking, what can outdo the Maxim gun, right? The great conqueror of Africa, right? This early machine gun is literally given. The first Maxim gun is given on an exploration to go into Africa to rescue these British explorers or what have you. And the whole point when it's given to them is like, oh no, I think this will have a psychological impact on the natives, right? That this precursor to the machine gun will so impact them that they will scatter. Right. And I thought about how the Maxim gun is then used heavily in the conquering and colonialism of Africa, then it's used in Asia. And, you know, I'm teaching classes at the time. I was adjuncting, and I'm teaching these classes on world history. And I'm reading Edward Said. I'm showing the Battle of Algiers in class. And I remember thinking, like, what can outdo the Maxim gun? I was like, oh, I think I need some magic. Well, and magic was my undoing.
It's such a clever juxtaposition because, of course, there's that old cliche or saying, like any sufficiently advanced technology will appear as magic.
Yeah.
You know, and the one thing I really appreciated about the Dead Djinn universe was it's not just magic is introduced and it does cool stuff. It's that there's a real effort to reckon through how would this affect things geopolitically.
Yeah.
Like Egypt would be, which is the source of the kind of magical emanations, would become a global superpower essentially, and would put sort of Britain in the Industrial Revolution would no longer be the hottest thing that's happening.
Not the hottest thing, especially since this is magic also melded with technology. Because I was trying to get away from the idea of, you know, if you go with Said, the East is primitive magic. It's like they have magic, but they're also it's helping them build like amazing technology that the West doesn't have, right? I think the only people who've caught up, if you ever read my book, is Germany. Because Germany has tried to tap into its own folklore.
Right.
And me doing anybody know my Edward and Fichte, I'm doing my tapping into nationalism and German romanticism. And because they've tapped into their folklore, they've managed to get magic, whereas Britain and others are having a problem.
Yeah. Why is the US so anti-magic in the Dead Djinn universe?
Of course the US is going to, right? It's like I decided like the US 1890s, I'm thinking about the U.S. itself, the rise. We're about to soon have the rise. 1912, we're very close to having the Klan. This is the rise of the second Klan. And I thought about how this era of progressivism, and like when we think about small p progressivism, this idea of progressive era is very different than what I've told my students. When I say progressive, don't get your mind thinking like, oh, they were really for these. Yeah, they were for cleaning up things like the Hudson River and these other things and getting some of the problems of industrialization and creating unions. But this was also an era of heightened anti-immigration fervor, heightened racial ideologies, and all of these other things that are coming along, class issues and everything else. And so I was like, of course, the United States being what it was, of course, if it comes up, I can't imagine them being, oh yeah, let's go with this magic thing. The U.S., of course, is going to be like, no, ban on magic, none of that. And I also have it that it's helping out, like, I allude, like, in A Master of Djinn, that I allude to something that actually a horrific lynching of a guy named Robert Charles in New Orleans in the early 1900s. But he's a black man who's lynched, but before he has shootouts and, like, it causes a stir in the city. It actually causes a lot of black New Orleanians to leave, and that helps create the jazz diaspora. A lot of them leave, and they bring stories about that. What happened with Robert Charles. And so I have in there where he uses magic, right? And I was like, and then they're like also getting problems. I allude like Native Americans are now acting up, right? Because they've discovered magic again. So it's something that the U.S., it's more problems than it helps.
Yeah, well, in the U.S. imagination, or in the American imagination, there's a line of thinking that precisely what makes the nation a modern, sophisticated, mature world power on the stage is that it's overcoming of superstition, it's overcoming of magic. And so there's a way in which it's
the old world.
Yeah, it's covering a veneer of insecurity, right? And so it makes perfect sense why.
That they and England, would be the two who are like, no, we don't want any part of that.
That what it means to be modern is that we are no longer superstitious. We no longer believe in these totems of the past.
Right. And so they're losing out on the others. Like I said, the Germans are the only one. Also, Germany, a new nation, right? That Germany's brand new. And so there's a way that, and how do they knit themselves together? By, getting all those folklores and telling people, hey, you're all German now. I know we've been beating each other up for a long time, but Prussia, you're German, let's all get together and be German. And so there was a way in history I got to use that to segue on why Germany manages to do this. But yeah, these older empires have not.
Yeah. So I think you're tell me
is trying.
Yes. So tell me if this is wrong, but I think you're comfortable with the label speculative fiction.
Yeah, that's the label. I know people argue as genre or speculative. I use speculative fiction as my umbrella for everything.
Right. So as you know, within that umbrella, the two major sort of camps are sort of science fiction or hard science fiction and fantasy. And the dividing line is the use of magic.
Right.
And so there has been.
How do you tell the two? Right.
Well, right. So that is maybe the most mature.
The question that the best thing I saw is what's his name who plays. He's the actor and he's now Butcher in The Boys. You know what I'm talking about. And he was in Star Trek, but he's also in Lord of the Rings. And I can't think of his name right now, but in one of them, there's like, he has long hair in Lord of the Rings. He has short hair where he's in Star Wars or he's in The Boys, right? So they're like, obviously the difference is hair. You have long hair in fantasy. You have shorter hair when you're in the future. And
so now, but I'm going to push you on this because there are others, and maybe they're all in the science fiction camp. Maybe people who write with magic don't really care about this distinction. But there are a lot of science fiction kind of fans and maybe even authors who are very uncomfortable with the use of magic and would seek to sort of expel authors who use that from the community. I mean, is that just an outdated view? Do you come across that?
Oh, there were definitely. I don't think they can, but there is definitely a hard science fiction snobbery. Mm-hmm. Like there are people like I do hard science fiction, and they know that I'm not doing science. I'm not doing science fiction where you can't tell what's happened. No. My science fiction makes sense, right?
Right.
My science fiction is based on some aspects of science, and there is some people who really like that, and they will tell you they don't read fantasy. They don't even read any science fiction where it's not fully explained. They need it to be very complicated and complex science fiction, and so I think there is that within the genre of speculative fiction. I don't know if it means much because fantasy now is doing so well. But there are some even say like there's not enough hard science fiction, that fantasy has come to dominate it too much, and they say we need to go back to finding more hard science fiction.
Well, we did a pod some months back on the three-body problem.
Yeah, there you go.
In particular, the Netflix adaptation. But yeah, I mean, that was I'm not a science fiction sort of aficionado in any way. But from reading the source material, I just found myself, there were just chunks and chunks of pages that I just could barely.
And that's one of the problems when I think he's a physicist. And so that can be a problem, and that's appealing to some people. But yes, for our listeners.
But it was notable. I thought that the Netflix adaptation did almost none of that.
Right,
or condensed it into like these.
The mediums have to
montages.
Got to be different. You can't do that. But
Boilerplate eunuchs are your form of AI in the Dead Djinn universe.
Yeah, like automatons.
100 and whatever years on, what are boilerplate eunuchs like in the Dead Djinn universe of 2024?
Oh, that's the trajectory that I'm going on in the Dead Djinn universe is that they're gaining sentience, and as they're gaining sentience, some of them are demanding rights. And so I can imagine by 2020-something, they have probably argued for citizenship in the society, and they probably have citizenship, right? Hopefully nobody's had a war over it, but they've had to find a reason to gain citizenship in the society. And the question is, how did that society react to that? Do they all have to leave? Are they able to gain citizenship? What happens? That's a great question.
Is there more in that universe coming, or have you kind of put that in the past?
Every time I've written a story in this world, the first story I wrote in this world, Dead Djinn Cairo, was supposed to be a one-off. Mm-hmm. Every story that I've written has been because people are like, is there going to be more? Mm-hmm. Down to the novel. I was not going to write a novel, and then I was like, okay, there'll be more. Yeah. And so I keep asking if there should be more, so if past is prologue, it seems that likely there will be. I'm not working on anything right now.
Okay.
But I will say this. The AI angle, the automaton angle has been, if I write something else, that might be the place I go down, just because it's been interesting to me. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit with you about Ring Shout.
Okay, yeah.
Which is this really fascinating story that takes place in Macon, Georgia. 1915, 1916.
Yeah, I would say I think I have it set around 1922, though I wanted it to be in 1919 for the Red Summer. I said in 1922.
Okay. Yeah. Coincident with the ongoing craze about the release of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation.
In fact, the second, he has a reshowing that year, which worked well for me. Yeah.
And there's really a lot of interesting stuff going on. And one of the things that I found really interesting in reading your acknowledgments at the end of the story was your mining of the Works Progress Administration archives. Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of doing that, how you sort of imagined that source material as informing the narrative.
Yeah, that source material is probably at the heart of the narrative. And I did not know I was going to write the story when I came across it. I was actually... unlike everybody today gets their MA and PhD together, I got my MA first. Then I went for PhD. So that means I had 2 masters somewhere, right? Because they make you do it twice. So I went for an MA and I did my my master's thesis using the Works Progress Amendment, using the ex-slave narratives from there to talk about, it's called Violent Women, Violent Culture, to talk about enslaved women who initiated violence in order to break free of slavery or to find some way to free them, right? Slavery is violence as resistance. And so I was just going through those narratives, reading as much as I can because I'm just trying to find as much info. And it was in there that I first come across these former slaves in this last generation of enslaved people who were still alive in the late 1920s and 1930s. Because even before the WPA, people like Zora Neale Hurston and others have been doing them for Fisk University and for Black University. They've actually started doing them there. And the WPA kind of comes on and takes us on and makes it a bigger thing. But them talking about the founding of the first Klan, because they're getting asked a lot of questions about that by their interviewers. So you think about it, the second Klan is just waning in support. They had been this big thing. Everybody's known about them. So everybody's like, we want to know more about the first Klan. And they're talking about them. And these ex-slaves describe the first Klan very differently than we would think of them. They describe the first Klan, for instance, as many of them not wearing hoods. A lot of the Klan that we know today come from D.W. Griffith's version of the Klan. And so this Klan, they say, sometimes wore flour or sacks on their heads. Sometimes they blackened their faces. So sometimes they were in blackface. Sometimes they would wear chains to rattle, to scare people on horses, right? Or they would do this thing where they could drink a ton of water. And they would have this siphon, right? And they would basically show that we are supernatural beings who can drink all of this water all at once. And some people, by the way, knew who these folks were. They were like, yeah, we know you're not a ghost. You're Judge so-and-so who lives south because I work for you. I was enslaved by you. Or they could tell they have this thing behind them that they're pretending to drink this water. But still, as bizarre as that seems, this first Klan is also terrorizing, right? They are killing people. They are beating people. They are trying to, they're in this basically a terrorist insurgency group of the Confederacy, right? Who are too afraid to attack Union soldiers, so they attack the soft underbelly, who are the former slaves, who they blame for everything, and anybody who tries to help them. And there was a way that I thought it was interesting that these formerly enslaved people kind of remembered their trauma by using folklore, which is what horror is kind of about, right? The horror scholar Kenitra Brooks, she talks about Black horror and how Black horror is often about trauma, right? Black horror goes into looking at forms of trauma, like Black people aren't scared of Freddy Krueger and Jason, scared of white supremacy, right? That's the horror. And so I thought it was fascinating that they used this folklore of the Klan as monsters. And they were even, by the way, if you wanted to stop them, they couldn't cross water. Right? Or you put vines out on the road and their horses would trip or they couldn't touch them. And so they made them these supernatural beings, even though they understood these were people, to talk about their trauma. And from there, I took that idea for Ring Shout and imagining the Klan as monsters. Even though I didn't know what I wanted to do with it when I first did it. It was 10 years before I wrote the story, right? But the idea...
Oh, you had that idea for 10 years?
I basically, as I'm going through finding stuff for my master's thesis, I basically wrote down... This is where I wrote down notes to come back to. And I held on to those. Let's say with the Night Doctors, where I first learned about Night Doctors from the WPA narratives. And so when I wrote the story, when I was finally ready to write them, I owe it to those former slaves who first came up with this, right? And I put as much of that into the story as possible. The only thing I didn't get to put in was I didn't get to do my quotes that were going to go direct from the WPA narratives. That they got lost in the editing process. But I got to use one of them for the introduction.
I mean, it's such a brilliant conceit because it plays on the film, Birth of a Nation, in its technical sort of brilliance, almost was seen to be supernatural or magical kind of at the time. Yeah. And the other thing I thought was just brilliant. Tell me if I'm misreading it or overreading it or whatever. But a thing I really appreciated was the sort of bifurcation you make in the members of the Ku Klux Klan, and you've got your evil kind of demonic side, and then you've got your just straight up morons, right? And it seemed like that organization was
she calls them fools.
That's it. Yeah, the collision of absolute stupidity and pure evil.
Right. Yeah. Meat.
Right. Meat. And I did this on purpose because I said, well, I'm writing this story, and I knew the story was going to be, of course, this metaphor about racism and everything else and white supremacy. I knew that there was a danger when we talked about analogies before, metaphors. There's a danger that people could walk away from this. He said, he's saying that racism was caused by monsters, right? And if we just get rid of those monsters, we get rid of racism. No, I'm not saying that at all, right? No, humanity is able to create all those things by themselves. And so I wanted to make certain there was a differentiation between those people who have gone so far into it, right? That they've allowed this hatred to basically haul them out, to destroy them within and let these demonic creatures take over them, these otherworldly creatures. And there are the other people, the morons, who have dipped their foot in here, but they haven't gone that way yet. So you know what? There's still a chance that they don't have to go that way, right? Also allows a redemption here, right? Where people say, you're giving redemption to the clay? I know. I'm saying that my point is that people choose to do this. It's not being done to them, right? I think in there's even somebody that says, like, when the evil creature says, you do all this to yourselves. Like, we just come along and give direction, right? And so there's always a chance. I think even at the end of Ring Shot, I have where there's a woman who can see finally. She's a Klan member, right? And she sees. And like, the question is, what does she do with that now? Now that she sees and she's not open. So there's this, I wanted to leave that open because I want to make sure there's agency here. Not only is there the idea that they can walk away from this, but there's also agency that if they do this to themselves, they do this to themselves, right? That they are choosing to do this. Yeah. And so I wanted to make sure that no one walked away with the idea that they were just inherently bad or it was something beyond their control. No, they are absolutely responsible for what they choose to do to themselves. Yeah.
So the new book is The Dead Cattails.
The Dead Cattail Assassins.
Just
different.
Set the scene for us on this one.
First of all, I wanted to write this. People know me as I write alternative histories and all this. My first love is fantasy. I love give me a good Robert Jordan, thick fantasy tome. Give me some old school Dungeons & Dragons. Like I read Dragonlance. I love fantasy. Secondary world. Has its own way of being political, but is not our world. Right? And so this is what The Dead Cattail Assassins is. This is not alternative history. You cannot find this world on a map. It is a hodgepodge of different histories and cultures. The main city this is set up in is diverse as medieval Swahili city-states to 17th century London, all of it to Renaissance Italy to Angkor Wat, all smashed into one.
Oh, you say it's not political, but the main character is literally killing the patriarch.
It's killing. That's what I'm saying. It's not. I was saying it's not as overtly political as say Ring Shot, or Master Gene, where it's set in our world. But I'm a person who's like, of course, there's always politics, right? You want to get the politics out of my Star Wars. Yeah, not the show about space Nazis. Politics are in there. So definitely that cover is political. Cover I would not have seen growing up when I was younger because covers have to be whitewashed.
Oh, yeah,
right?
You're a woman of color.
This kind of, having a woman of color in fantasy, that's, you can count, until recently.
Well, you might have done, but she would have to be wearing a bikini and...
Right, or something of the sort, right? Simply having, so all of this. So there are definitely politics, but on the other hand, this is a secondary world about an undead assassin, Aveen, who is given an impossible task, basically, right? So I pitched it as John Wick meets Dungeons and Dragons, right? And it is basically the story of the assassin. What happens when the assassin is given a task they don't take? They become the hunted, right? And so this
very
is
Jason Bourne as well.
Yeah, very Jason Bourne. It's so there's so many. It's a trope. You go on TV tropes. I'm sure it'll be the trope. The assassin who has to be on the run from the other assassins. Yeah, but it works. And this one, I just, I had the undead and a whole lot of magic.
So I don't mean to be constantly pushing you for more work, but is there more of Aveen the Eviscerator, or is this a one-off?
I will say this, the world that I wrote this in, I have already published 3 short stories in this world. However, those short stories are not about Aveen. They're not set in this city. they're set in completely different parts of this world with completely different characters doing completely different things. But in this book, especially, in each story, each new one, there are little Easter eggs. If you read this last story, you say, wait a minute, didn't I read about this city? Wasn't this like throwaway line about the city? Wasn't that in this other book? And in this one, there's a lot of that. And so I have several readers who called me and they said, wait a minute, you mentioned this city and these gods. That's from that short story you wrote. They were like, oh my God, is it all that's it?
I was going to ask you, is that a Popcast exclusive? Were you revealing this for the first time?
I think so. I've said it to a few people. Some people have said it to me, but I haven't announced it. I said, I'm going to announce it on Instagram or something where it's like, I might do a giveaway where if you can find the short story this was in, I send you a book. So
okay. All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so we have to say thank you so much for such a generous, giving us your time so generously in such a rich conversation. P. Djèlí Clark and Dexter Gabriel.
Yeah. You can find my books at pjllyclark.com. My agent says I should always say that.